Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Choose Inclusion. Thank you all for joining us again for our Black Voices Matter segment. We always appreciate it, and we hope you're learning as much as we are. And when I say we, I'm talking about my dear co-hosts Nina and Mike. How are you two this morning?
I'm doing okay. How are you all?
Doing good, thanks. Excited for
Good.
today's guest. Excited.
Yeah, me too. And we're really lucky that Travis and Stephanie reached out to us. So Travis Stovall is a couple of cool things. So he's co-founder and CEO of a company called eRep Inc. And then he's also just announced his candidacy for mayor of Gresham, Oregon. So we're going to get into all of that on this conversation. But first of all, welcome, Travis, and how you doing?
Doing excellent. Thank you so much, UB, for the opportunity to share here. But I'm doing well, broadcasting live here from Gresham, Oregon.
And Mike, you've been to that area, Mike? You and your family have traveled up that way?
We have lots of family up in from Vancouver, Washington, which is in the southern end, right across the Columbia River from Portland. So about 10 miles away from where Travis is right now, but love the Northwest.
Awesome. Well, so Travis, we talked a little bit last week, and I think, one of the things, like I said before, we've been learning so much just about Black history and Black Lives Matter and the Black community. And I think that's super important because I know in a lot of conversations that I have with family and friends, they don't know a lot of what's been happening for hundreds of years. But one of the things that we talked about was about you growing up in a red line community in Kansas. Like I grew up in the same area, and again, no idea. What is that? What is that? What does that mean? What is that concept of a red line community?
Great question, UB. It starts with just the understanding of kind of how systemic and systematic discrimination was, and the challenges that exist in that, and then the follow-on generational challenges that then are fraught from something like the redlining concept. So back, in the mid 1900s, as you get to the 1940s and 50s and 60s, there's situations where the real estate community, real estate agents, realtors, what they would do is draw a red line around certain communities within cities. And these communities would then be considered redlined. And what they would do is say that you could only sell a house to a Black person within these specific redlined communities. And in those communities, various types of community investments did not happen. So we would consider that to be a disinvestment into these areas and regions. And so many things were I wouldn't say not allowed, but so many things were absent in these areas of redline communities, the investments into education, the investments into parks and community type resources. Those types of things just didn't happen in these regions, in these areas. And so it was this focus on congregating Blacks within these certain redline communities, and thus not allowing them to access many of the things that our non-minority counterparts had the opportunity to access, such as real estate in nicer communities, more urban settings, and then of course more suburban settings, which those were considered off limits for African Americans to be able to move their families to. And there's a myriad of stories of the horrific things that sometimes would happen if that was attempted. And so when I grew up in the inner city of Kansas City, Kansas, in this redline community, of course, growing up, we didn't know it because we weren't able to kind of compare it to what our non-minority counterparts were able to access and envision. And so we didn't even understand truly the challenges that we were existing in and the things we were missing out on, just opportunity. When you think about just opportunity, much of it is tied to our zip code and where we live. access to various levels of education, access to employment, access to social circles. All of those things, and many of those things, are highly impacted by our zip code. And some people think, well, Travis, come on, how realistic is that? Well, when you think about just a simple concept of getting a job, many times the person making the decision says, well, this person lives too far away from our location. And that was many times the case because the professional jobs weren't in the communities that were redlined. They were in our non-minority communities that we didn't have access to because of the time it would take to get there, and the concept of, well, they won't be able to make it to work on time, or they won't be able to make it to work consistently. And so these are the many things that are subtle in their initial presentation, but have deep impact. And so that's a challenge because ultimately it's very difficult to break out of the cycle when that's the case. I'll just finish by commenting on this one quick thing. My dad bought the house my parents still live in almost 50 years ago, and he paid about $5,000 for it. Today, that house is worth about $35,000. So if they sold it, they could buy, kind of a middle of the line average car. So clearly, there's a challenge there because there's no ability to move up in the concept of real estate, and they did everything right. They worked 2 to sometimes 3 jobs to provide for the family, stayed in the house, had that foundation, and still have very little to show for it at this juncture in their lives, which is challenging to consider.
I mean, I think that's such an important point to bring up because I think that there's this falsehood of the American dream where if you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you can get ahead. And there are these systemic issues that make it impossible for certain groups, particularly the Black community. And this isn't by accident. This is very much in its design. And I think one of the things that we always are told is oh, buy a house, that's your opportunity to generate wealth. Home ownership is your way to generate the wealth you need to kind of grow and move forward and pass something down to your kids. I mean, how did this impact your journey into kind of your career, kind of growing up in this and seeing these inequities?
So again, it goes back to access, and that access is one of, specifically, and especially for me, you don't, so many things are built upon social circles, and those social circles allow for access. I always say it's who you know that gets you in and what you know that moves you up. And so there's some opportunity once you get in, but you have to get in. And so many times we don't even get the opportunity for entrance into the conversation because we don't have the connections, the contacts, those things that really begin to give us opportunity. But then once we essentially have that open door, so if you work hard, you continue to be persistent, you might get that open door. Well, when that door opens, you still don't have the type of resources your non-minority counterparts have. Nina, you just mentioned something critical, and it's this concept of generational wealth. The production of generational wealth can be, can absolutely give individuals access and opportunity, but it also can give them an unfair advantage in the sense that if I don't have the opportunity to access the same type of investments, the same type of returns that my non-minority counterparts have access to, then that's going to put me at a significant disadvantage. So my non-minority counterparts could refinance their home and start a new business and take that to the next level. And it's this compounding effect that goes on and on and on. Well, as I just referenced, my parents couldn't refinance their home and provide for me much of anything because their house still isn't worth much. And it's a nice home. I mean, it's nothing special, but it certainly is something that's been well taken care of over the years. They've made investments into the house and all of those things. And so those types of things are limiting in regards to my opportunity to step into this space of entrepreneurship, which is challenging in and of itself to be an entrepreneur, but to be a Black entrepreneur, the difficulty explodes exponentially because, again, of the access that we don't have, starting from where I started from. But eventually my parents saw the inadequacy of the inner city school system and took us out and commuted us out to the suburbs. And that's where we actually went to school from about 7th and 8th grade on. So we had access now to a different ecosystem, which gave us much different exposures to opportunities. And that's, I tell people all the time, that is what absolutely made the difference for us. Where there's 4 of us children and 3 of us now hold master's degrees, which I believe master's degrees are in America are held by a single digit percentage. So just a single digit percentage of people hold master's degrees, and 3 of my siblings, me included, hold master's degrees out of 4. And that's a pretty impressive accomplishment that my parents, worked hard to allow us to move forward. And I love the saying, people say, well, if you got, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And I always say, well, you have to have boots to be able to have bootstraps.
I love it, Travis. And I'm hoping this next question really proves to listeners just how qualified you are for the upcoming mayor race. So I'm predicting a win here. But going back to the red line district concept, isn't it true, like that red line district concept also then created very predatory lending practices that was very zip code based, and were also very that they were financial instruments of oppression? I'd love to get your take on that.
So yeah, Mike, yeah, you of course nailed it. The Color of Law, that's one of my favorite books to recommend because it just does a great job of bringing a cogent argument to this type of conversation. So Richard Rothstein, he says it. He goes, I'm just going to give you the outputs of the research. I'm not going to bring in, my own personal bent or in this. He does that in the appendix, but throughout the book, he just gives the data and the information. And the thing that he references and highlights is that at one point in the mid 1900, there was a kind of a focus of the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, to not allow Blacks within the community, the red line communities, to access mortgage insurance. And without mortgage insurance, we couldn't get traditional mortgages, which completely nixed us from having the opportunity to do the things that we're talking about based on purchasing a home and staying in that home. And so we actually, being, of course, African Americans, again, I didn't exist, during the height of this, but, my parents did, and my dad would have been under a similar constraint, where they actually had these hybrid financial instruments where you could purchase the house on a contract and you actually didn't build equity. So you made the payments every month. Eventually, if you missed payments, then they actually would just take the house back. If you sold the house before the contract was done, you actually did not build equity in that home. And so the house you didn't have any opportunity to control the house as an asset as we do with traditional mortgages until the house was completely paid off. And that was generally over a long period of time. Of course, seeing interest rates that were significantly higher than anything that traditional mortgages were in because they were considered more risky. So those were, there's a myriad of predatory lending that went well into the 1990s and 2000s. If you do a quick read of the mortgage debacle that happened, of course, within 2007, 2008, that led to the Great Recession, Blacks were significantly more harmed throughout all of that than the non-minority counterparts because of the predatory lending that was done in these communities to get folks, excited about maybe purchasing something and then maybe getting into something they didn't understand or appreciate. And many saw their homes, foreclosed on in those situations. And folks might say, well, Travis, shouldn't they just be educated? Well, it's difficult when we don't have access to all of that information and data to be adequately educated and make the right decision.
Well, this goes even beyond mortgages. Everything. This is where the systemic aspect of this, like, it's threaded through insurance and just everything you can think of. And that was my point earlier, that the white community, they don't know, right? I mean, I choose to believe that most just don't know that exists, that insurance agents would put codes on people of color's applications to hand to the underwriter to indicate, hey, this is a person of color, don't grant them this. That, and that kind, I mean, it's and to your point, like this wasn't, before our lifetimes. This was up until now still.
Yeah, there's still not a lot of protections that came out of the 2007 housing crisis for the communities, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And of course, as you referenced again, I mean, we go back to the concept of our zip code. I mean, they don't even really have to place the code in there to identify in the race or ethnicity of an individual. They can do it just by looking at the zip code, and we know that zip code is predominantly African American, and so you're relatively safe just by like, okay, if this zip code shows up, there's a 10% premium on their insurance, not on their house, on their car, on all of these things, which again causes a premium and a penalty to occur on the financial households of African Americans. African Americans have 10% of the household wealth as our non-minority counterparts. 10%. That is, when you hear that, it's just, you think that is such a travesty, to have that wealth disparity and have folks say, well, there's no reason why we should be thinking that African Americans face any type of discrimination. That to me, that's a little bit mind-boggling to understand the disconnect between kind of that one statistic. African Americans have 10% of the wealth that our non-minority counterparts have. And a lot of it's based on, of course, generational wealth, and the aspect that once you have the ability to have something that compounds, it's very difficult to catch up because the compounding gets greater and greater.
So one of the things, I think it's really interesting that we're talking about the finance component, especially mortgages and loans and things, because there's this concept of approval and disapproval, right? And Travis, you had talked about that to us, about kind of the constructs built around approval and disapproval are the bedrock of why discrimination exists today. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. I mean, I smile because it's so rampant within our society and our communities and our country, of this approval disapproval construct. And so much of what we do in life, what we don't have access to, what we have access to, is about kind of the approval disapproval context. I mean, almost everything we want to take part in. You think back to something very basic. Let's think back to the concept of joining a country club. Joining the country club has a significant process of approval disapproval. And so this approval disapproval then allows for us to either overtly discriminate or to quietly discriminate. And so historically, joining the country club was overt for women and minorities. It was overt. It was just well known. You can't join this country club. And well, at the country club, if you were in business, that's where a lot of business was done. So then you're nixed out of all of this additional opportunity that comes with being in that social circle. And so that's a very simple kind of example of this concept of approval disapproval. Well, that actually permeates everything we do in our society, is approval disapproval. And it's usually the dominant culture, powerful majority, that controls north of 90% of all the approval disapproval. And so when we think about this idea of what we're able to access as minorities, as Blacks and African Americans, we must go through kind of this gate of approval disapproval, and it makes you nervous. I mean, when I know that I'm going into a new situation that I'm going to have to deal with, I get nervous because I say, well, am I going to get approved for this? And it's fascinating because sometimes I can go through a process where the person or the individuals making the decision, the approval, disapproval, have no idea of my race. And it's a much different process than if they do know my race. And I've seen it, I've experienced it, I know it's real, and it's just something that just many times surprises you as you have these experiences. But it's what allows for, again, this overt discrimination, but also this subvert or quiet discrimination that occurs just absolutely all the time. 1% of all venture capital is and of course, I'm an entrepreneur. I've built a company. 1% of all venture capital goes to Black founders. The approval, disapproval. So a major portion of growing and building a company that scales is truly related to getting access to capital, and somewhat inefficient capital, which venture capital is. And so having access to that capital is critical to see the type of growth that we have the opportunity of seeing. And when only 1% of venture capital goes to African American founders, that's challenging. But we exist in the space of approval, disapproval. So we don't get to play the entrepreneurship game at that level because the approval, disapproval is in place. My company has traction. We have talented people, we have business, we have customers. And still, every time I meet with venture capitalists, I get told, well, you got to get one more thing. You got to get this next thing. You got to get this next thing. And it feels to me like an ever moving kind of target that we need to meet. But again, we fall under the approval, disapproval concept that we must go through the powerful majority to achieve things in life.
And to me, this screams, Travis, of, again, this goes back to how many of the Black community even, understand the venture capital because of access, because of, is that education teaching them about entrepreneurship? I just feel like there's this, it's a circle here. It's very cyclical. And then, like, what are the numbers? You probably know the numbers of the Black community that run for office, like public office leadership roles. Like, what are the numbers there? And please, I'd love to know, like, I'd love to hear more about your campaigning right now. We need, the country needs, I think, true leadership like you in public spaces. So I'd love to hear more about this and the numbers and all that kind of stuff.
Another great question, Mike. Actually, I don't have the numbers. My team has actually been looking at some of this information, specifically in Oregon, but across the country, to look at what's the access that we have. Very quickly, during this this conversation of social injustice, many people have asked me, Travis, what can we do? And I always say three things. I say the first thing is to educate yourself. Educate yourself on kind of the Black experience here in America. And you don't even have to go back to slavery. I mean, I think you should, because you need to understand the atrocity that was slavery in our country. But I say, go back just 50 years, read The Color of Law, understand what's happened in the last 50 years and many of our current lifetimes. Next up, I say, defend with your voice. So utilize your voice to defend what we have to do as a country to move forward and ensure we have a more just future. And then lastly, I say, amplify the voices of the disadvantaged. Amplify our voices. And that's what running for mayor, gives me the opportunity to do. It allows me to get my voice amplified and lean into and provide leadership, for our city that's going through some struggles, and so that's really what my passion is about, making sure that our city moves forward, our voices are heard. Similar to, and I'm gonna overlay this concept with something that just recently happened. As the mayor and the mayor for Gresham is more like the board of directors rather than the mayor doesn't run the city. We have a city manager. And so it's kind of board of directors. And something similar that I was just added to was the Digital Trends board of directors. And this is the amplification of voices. Digital Trends, phenomenal company, one of the largest independent media companies in America. And they recently added me to their board of directors, giving me the opportunity and ability to amplify my voice and lean into that organization so that inclusion and equity is not just something that gets added to the handbook or added to the initiative, like we're going to do this, but it permeates every decision because it has to. We have to look through the equity lens. And so, similar to running for mayor, now, and this just recently happened, and now I get an opportunity to, in a private sector company, join that board so I can lean into and, have conversations and discussions that, again, aren't about overlaying some initiative that's going to feel like it's added to the conversation, but it's going to permeate. Similar thing for the mayor of Gresham. It's really having the opportunity to permeate many of the decisions and conversations that we have to ensure that equity and inclusion becomes something that isn't an also as, but it is part of the core conversation and discussion and is included in that. So we've got about 110 to 111,000 citizens. And so that's a pretty good sized city that we have to lean into. And the prior mayor, who stepped down recently because his concept was, I want to ensure that I step out of the way to allow someone who has lived experience to step into this role and help guide our city forward. And so he said in his resignation letter, the best outcome for the city of Gresham is if we elect Travis Stovall as our next mayor. So the endorsement doesn't get any better than that. A well-loved 14-year mayor here in the city, Mayor Shane Bemis, said that as he in his resignation letter. So that's a powerful endorsement and a way that someone in the powerful majority is amplifying the voice of the disadvantaged.
I mean,
oh my goodness. Oh
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, all I want to say is fantastic. That is so cool.
Yes. Well, and that's, I mean, what an example. And I think that, because I challenge all people, all white people in positions of power to think about, like, hey, had things truly been equal, then would I be in this position that I'm in, right? Like it's sort of a daunting thing for us to think about, but since things are the way they are, the example that previous mayor is showing here and stepping aside and realizing, it's time for someone from this community with this voice to lead us is huge. And I think I think more people need to do that. More people need to stand up. I mean, we're sort of seeing it a little bit on all white boards of companies where people are giving up their seat for a person of color. And that's how I think change really starts to take hold, is we need to see that kind of action. So Travis, man, this has been such an amazing conversation. We're excited for your mayoral candidacy, and anything we can do to help, obviously. But thank you for today. I mean, just tremendous conversation.
If so, after you win, can we be the first podcast that you come on?
Yes, I mean, for those who are with me along the path, it's really about making sure that we circle back and have deeper conversations. So for sure, let me know. I would love to return.
But by the way, Travis, I'm kind of in sales, so I want to make sure I close the loop. Okay, buddy. So
always be closing.
Always be closing.
Oh, I love it. Well, again, Travis, thank you so much for everything. Nina and Mike, as always, thank you. And audience, thank you for continuing to tune in. We're going to continue bringing Black voices to our audience so we can all learn and grow and choose to change together. So check it out, chooseinclusion.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, soon to be Amazon Prime Music, I think. And yeah, we'll keep coming at you. So thank you all very much, and take care.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Thanks, Travis.
Thank you very much.